Distinguished guests, dear participants, we welcome you to this webinar, which is an event organized by Soteria International, together with the Center for Studies on New Religions, CESNUR, the European Federation for Freedom of Belief, FOB, and Human Rights Without Frontiers. Event which raises once again the situation on MISA, the movement for spiritual integration into the absolute. My name is Camelia Marin. I am a human rights activist, Deputy Director of Soteria International. Working in Soteria International, we aim at re-establishing a constructive dialogue between the state and social actors, together with spiritual practitioners, in order to decrease the gap of misunderstanding and stop the violations of human rights that resulted from it. The webinar today will raise the concern on the human rights violations, institutional discrimination, social and media marginalization on MISA yoga students and the yoga teacher Gregorian Bivolaru. And also, in the end, we will have the possibility to speak about the book that Professor Massimo Introvigne wrote regarding the teachings of MISA. In our work, this webinar is a very good opportunity to underline the importance of the dialogue, the common voice, and efforts to help and support the respect of human rights when it comes to spiritual communities. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights is a milestone document in the history of human rights. Still, we can say that there is a great need for a holistic and integrated approach regarding the human rights and addressing the fundamental and core parts of the problem at hand, that is people's mindset, attitudes, orientations, and relationships towards one another. Public fear and ignorance regarding unfamiliar religious traditions, discrimination, and hate speech increasingly target religious minorities or new religious movements. This reaction on unfamiliar thoughts and religious started at the end of the last millennium with France and Belgium's arbitrary sect lists. Instead of discussing ideas and insights, the public debate turned to speculations on criminal intent, subversive plans, and mind manipulation. Under this suspecting perspective, volunteer work was investigated as human trafficking, and consensual love affair was scrutinized as potential sexual abuse, etc. We have reached a time where certain behaviors, initiations, and rituals, or actions related to a spiritual path can be considered as material elements of criminal case simply because they do not fall within the norms known and accepted by the society. If we take individually such case of a spiritual community accused of criminal intent, we can remain passive in front of the dark side presented in media or in the doubtable evidences presented by prosecutors, just because it seems to be a particular situation. But when we look to a larger perspective, observing the similarities from such cases worldwide, noticing the same pattern of accusations on fraud or human trafficking or sexual abuse, then we feel to take a stand and wish to find the truth and to support the spiritual communities in need. This is why we are here today, and thank you again to all our distinguished guests and their research and efforts done. During time, we studied cases from different countries in Europe, as for example, Ananda Sisi and Archeon in Italy, Oggen Kunzang Sholin in Belgium, Poetry Esoteric Institute in Czech Republic, MISA in Romania, and other cases. Our webinar today brings together distinguished guests, scholars, to analyze and synthesize MISA Yoga School case and the complex case of the yoga teacher Gregorian Bivolaru. MISA, Movement for Spiritual Integration into the Absolute, is a non-profit association founded in Romania in January 1990, shortly after the Romanian anti-communist revolution of 1989. It has a socio-professional, psychological, philosophical, and educative character, aiming to rise the spiritual level of people by spreading the yoga knowledge and practices. For understanding the context of MISA setting up and the development of MISA Yoga School, we have to point out that the practice of yoga has been forbidden in Romania between 1982 and 1989. Yoga was illegal in Romania until December 1989, the moment of Romania Revolution. And for this reason, Gregorian Bivolaru was permanently under observation by the Romanian Securitate Service because he was practicing and teaching yoga, and also because he was exchanging letters with Mircea Eliade, a Romanian historian of religion, fiction writer, philosopher, and professor at University of Chicago. After the Romanian Revolution, Gregorian Bivolaru became officially free to practice and teach yoga, and together with a group of yogi friends, founded MISA. Their yoga conferences and courses had a tremendous success, and then tens of thousands of people registered to the yoga classes organized by MISA in Romania and abroad. To remind briefly the case that we discussed today, on 18 March 2004, Romanian authorities conducted an unprecedented, massive attack on the spiritual community of MISA Yoga School, using brutal force and weapons against its peaceful inhabitants. The attack was broadcasted nationwide, marking the beginning of one of the most devastating and sinister defamation and marginalization campaign in Romania media, directed against the movement MISA and its followers. The yoga teacher, Gregorian Bivolaru, left Romania and obtained refugee status in Sweden on the ground of persecution based on his beliefs. During time, Romania refused to at least look at the human rights violations in this case and continue with the discrimination of MISA participants. In 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, in different decisions, European Court for Human Rights has ruled in favor of MISA participants and yoga teacher Gregorian Bivolaru, who were affected by the attack in 2004. European Court of Human Rights unequivocally states that Romanian authorities have majorly violated human rights when handling the case of MISA and yoga teacher Gregorian Bivolaru. The situation escalated at international and EU level in 2016 when yoga teacher Gregorian Bivolaru, having refugee status in Sweden, was arrested in France and extradited to Romania. And now, having just this little introduction, we can easily put the question, what happened and why MISA Yoga School and Gregorian Bivolaru were under unprecedented attack from authorities in Romania, and how that Mr. Bivolaru case became a precedent of non-respecting Geneva Convention in EU. I invite my colleague, Konrad Svenninger, co-founder and board member of Soteria International, to share with us the perspective and his experience on this case.
Thank you very much, Camelia, and thank you all who participate as speakers and listeners to this conference now and in the recordings that will be available later. My name is Conan Svendinger. I have worked with this case for 15 years. And I'm so happy to be together with you. Many of you are names that I have heard your works, I have studied it, and it's a great fulfillment to finally sit with you in a conference that I believe, when I have heard your angles on it, will offer to a higher degree than before, not only outlining the persecutions that are quite obvious, but also hopefully the mechanism behind it, so that these things can be helped to disappear for the fundamental freedoms and human rights for us all. So I'm sitting here now in Sweden, where the spring is coming, and for Sweden it has been a quite strange situation, where this Romanian yogi arrived in 2004, 2005, asking for asylum from Romania. Romania was on the verge of entering the European Union, and still, when exhibiting the evidence in the Supreme Court, the Swedish government decided to protect him, according to the Geneva Convention, as a religious refugee. Romania continued to put pressure on Sweden, even within the European judicial collaboration, which was questioned. And Sweden remained adamant in its decision to protect Mr. Bivolaru. Even when he was later arrested in France, Swedish government still told the French government, this man is protected by us. He must not be extradited to continued persecution in Romania. This is not a small thing. This shows in the heart of Europe a failure of human rights, of rule of law, and discrimination against certain subgroups on their religious beliefs and behaviors. And during these 15 years, I have met a lot of representatives from MISA. I must say that I know the school and its practices very well, but also lawyers, experts, politicians, and also many other spiritual practitioners who come together to support this case, and at the same time are astonished by the misfit between the actual facts and the very aggressive repression from the state. Why is a yoga school persecuted? It's like the first question when you meet politicians to talk about that. How can that happen? And Dr. Gabriel Andrescu, who is the founder of Helsinki Committee in Romania, is one of those experts who has truly dedicated a lot of his time to go in depth with this. He has written 2 books on this persecution of MISA in Romania. And according to him, he calls this the biggest human rights scandal in Romania, in post-communist Romania. And he has searched and researched the archives of Securitate and found that the first documented surveillance of Mr. Bivolaru are already from 1970. At this time, Mr. Bivolaru is just a young man of 18, 19 years old. He's still living in his home city, a small village, where it is testified by his childhood friends and his aunt. I heard testify these things that he was a kind of child prodigy. He was a very gifted already as a child with his studies, and becoming a teenager, he started to help villagers with different forms of healing. Even there was, the family arranged a special room where he would receive neighbors and locals in advising them. When he moves to Bucharest later on, the monitoring of his activities become threats of arrest, later arrest, and arrest with beatings, tortures of him and his followers. This is well documented, and we don't need to go into this here, because you can find these testimonies for example, on gregorianbivolaru.com, a website dedicated to outline and show these facts. What I think is very important is that Dr. Andrescu says, according to him, as he reads these files of Securitate, because they were persecuting many people, he said that they didn't really know how to deal with this because it was a political persecution, but it was not really a political opposition, but still it was an opposition. And but it was like a cultural opposition. It was as if the teachings of yoga and the teachings of Ms. Vivolaro provided an opposition without the political thing. So they were confused. Also, what confused them very much was that they continued to practice their yoga even if they were beaten, arrested, and harassed in the way that normally you let go, give up, or run the country. What he points out is that it even goes to the degree that they make a law in communist Romania specifically saying yoga is illegal then. It's against the people. By that, they lock him up, Vivolaro, and he is released together with the other political prisoners after the assassination of Ceausescu and his wife and the so-called revolution, or is it called revolution? Anyway, taking out of the communist regime. And with that, also his sentences that were put are rectified. It is clarified that it was a political persecution and he is free. But he is not, because the persecutions continue. During the 1990s, there is a pause and then it reassumes. When talking with Dr. Andrescu, he looks at structural reasons for this, that basically it's the same people who go to work also the next day. They maybe took out a few persons in the middle, but generally the same people are still doing their same job, and in order not to be proven wrong by themselves, many of the persecutions just continue in Romania, and that the Securitate continues to do it. And when, for example, Vibeke Sperling, the human rights writer and journalist of Politiken in Denmark, the biggest or second biggest paper there, she covers these persecutions, and she's clearly stating that Securitate is behind it. And in my experience, I felt that this was very correct and it was well proven, but there's something more and more profound. That is that the yoga somehow was still considered an opposition also to the post-communist regime. How can that be? Because still it's not a political movement, but somehow that the freedom or the encouragement that it's set free and cultivated somehow still was an opposition. And with that, I would like to go to this very interesting concept that Günther Jacobs, the German professor of law, has launched in what my German is not so good, but Feinstrafrechts, that if you are in opposition to society, law applies differently. That you have kind of stepped out of the society and therefore you should not be protected by society. And this is kind of legal, illegal. But anyway, if you belong to mobs, mafia, for example, this is clear, you are treated more harshly. In Sweden, we are now debating a lot about certain groups that create havoc in society and if they should be treated a little more harshly than those who do not. I mean, are you with society or against it? And also, when you look at how you pronounce a sentence in Swedish law, and I'm sure it's similar in other countries, you don't only look at the act, you also look at the criminal intent, meaning were you willing, would you follow the law if you could, but maybe out of ignorance or despair or hunger or fear or something, you came to break it, then you're less punished than if you have an intent to break down society. And of course, yoga school is not a mob. It's not a drug cartel. It's not a paramilitary, terrorist organization. But somehow it seems it is still considered subversive. And even this enemy of the people, vrak naroda, I think is a Russian expression of it, that you are against, and that was the reason why it was illegal, the yoga, it was against the interest. And could that be one of the reasons why this school, and not only this school, but generally, spiritual traditions that do not have a familiarity to it can be seen as subversive, and therefore kind of be treated differently, because it is clear how, like mentioning in the beginning, how human rights, international law is put aside. And what is interesting also is that the day of the raids in 2004, the prosecutor who was behind these raids, when he went on TV the same day, blue lights, police in the background, he says, this is the bigger anti-terror corps action in Romania. We have done a strike on a paramilitary organization dealing with drugs and weapons. And the yogis are, of course, extremely shocked to see, and they don't find any evidence of this as well. But it shows something. It shows that in order to be able to do such things, you need to have an enemy of the state. There's not enough with, they don't find any evidence of that, and then they change it to something that is also kind of subversive. So they go for human trafficking, and again, you can look at how that is voluntary work that is considered human trafficking, and sexual abuse. Even if there's no victims, neither to one or the other, it's clearly fabricated evidence and so on, but still they need kind of accusations that reach that level of being an enemy of the state, of being a subversive element of the state. And through that, these persecutions have been able to continue within the system. And I also put that kind of as a question. But during these 15 years that I have worked with the case, and I've been in numerous meetings with members of European parliaments, also president, the vice president of the commission, and representatives of the OSCE, national human rights councils, governments, and everyone is looking at the fact and see, but this doesn't match. There's a mismatch between the accusations, even if they would be true. I mean, the facts of the matter is not even legal, illegal, wouldn't even be criminal in Sweden, for example, what he was persecuted as the sexual abuse. What I remember very clearly is this, how can this happen? How can this happen? And I hope that we are moving closer to that, also to look into the mechanism, and I feel like we start to be there, and I'm very happy for it. Another thing that I remember very clearly was how he's a witness to the Swedish Supreme Court. He's a cult expert here in Sweden, known to be very hard on cults and so on. He was brought in, and I met him, and he really wanted to speak about this. And before we did the official interview, he told me privately, he leaned in and he said, I met Gregorian, as he called him. I said, and he's a very special person. In the beginning, you just see the long hair and so on, but when you speak with him, he's so humble, and he has nådegåvan, is what we call it in Swedish. He has the grace of God. And this is a man who is also a vicar in the Swedish church. I'm not sure he's still around, but he was. And the other thing he says is that we make an interview, and then he addresses directly to the Romanian governance and says, you need to do a bit of soul search. There's something wrong. And there's nothing wrong with looking back and saying, we made a mistake, and to rectify it. And what I see in this case, and in many other cases that we have followed, Camelia mentioned a few of them, is that state do not appreciate enough this motor of society coming from the civil society and the religious movements, the new religious movements, the spiritual aspirations for bringing a better world. And in order to reach there, we need not only to document and point out the abuses done, but also finding the mechanism behind it. And with that, I'm so happy to have you all experts with us in this meeting on the MISA case.
Our first scholar invited, Mr. Willy Fautré. He is the director and co-founder of Human Rights Without Frontiers. Willy was an active advocate for human rights in communist countries during the Cold War. He has extensive experience in freedom of religion or belief around the world. He's a member of the International Consortium on Law and Religious Studies. He has written many articles in university journals, held lectures in the academic conferences, testified before interstate organizations, and given interviews to international media. He is, since his creation, the foundation, he is the executive director of Human Rights Without Frontiers, and Human Rights Without Frontiers conducts research, field missions, analysis, and monitoring of a wide range of human rights concerns around the world. Mr. Fautré, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Minority religious and belief groups around the world are often victims of suspicion, prejudices, stigmatization, discrimination, fabricated charges, miscarriage of justice, intolerance, and even physical violence, although they teach and practice peace and love for all human beings without any distinction. This is the case for Ahmadis in Pakistan, for example, where they are considered heretics. This is the case with Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, where they are stigmatized as extremists and have been banned for 5 years now. This is the case for all faiths in China, where atheism is the doctrine of the CCP. But this is also the case in our European democratic countries with minority groups which were created in a recent past. Media outlets and public authorities stigmatize them as cults, harmful or dangerous, and that has quite a negative impact on the lives of their members. MISA is one of such groups in Romania. MISA, so Movement for Spiritual Integration in the Absolute, is a non-profit organization registered in 1990 in Bucharest. It was founded by 27 people, including their spiritual master, Gregorian Bivolaru. Its first objective is, and I quote, to raise the cultural and spiritual level of people through an adequate, deeply beneficial preparation to popularize knowledge in the fields of yoga. MISA is a loose network of training centers, yoga schools, and ashrams. Before the 2004 police crackdown, it numbered about 37,000 practitioners. In addition, there were about 40 ashrams in Romania, where some 750 people were living and practicing yoga. After the 2004 events, the number dramatically decreased due to the social panic instilled by the media. The project to destroy any unwelcome or socially, politically rejected group in societies which have a problem with the otherness concept usually follows a well-known pattern. First, using the media artillery, even with fake and fabricated news, to destroy the image of the group and get the support of public opinion when the time has come to resort to other weapons. Second, accusing the said group of representing a danger to society and the security of the country. Third, taking the said group and or its leader to court for alleged violations of the law, such as sexual abuse, which is quite often misused to this end. These three strategies were chronologically used against MISA and Gregorian Bivolaru. In this presentation today, I will focus on the fabrication of the criminal case against Gregorian Bivolaru as a way to try to get rid of MISA. First, about the fabricated case. On the 18th of March 2004, 300 masked policemen from the anti-terrorist forces crashed into 16 private homes of yoga practitioners, including the MISA library and some ashrams in Bucharest. The police removed people from their beds and forced them out at gunpoint during their search. The apartment of Gregorian Bivolaru was vandalized by police, and the door and windows were broken. Several individuals were taken to the police station and interrogated. Police video recordings of people in humiliating situations were leaked to the media and widely broadcasted. The police confiscated study materials about yoga, books and brochures, as well as private diaries and tapes of some yoga practitioners that were leaked again to the media and used for slandering. In the aftermath of the raid, the prosecutor's office filed a court case on sexual abuse of a minor and sexual perversion, as well as human trafficking allegedly committed by Gregorian Bivolaru. The concerned minor was interrogated for 13 hours without the help of a lawyer and outside the presence of her parents. She was forced to write a statement that was afterwards misused to give her the status of injured party, first without her knowledge and afterwards against her will, and in order to incriminate Gregorian Bivolaru. Despite the fact that with the help of a lawyer, she retracted her statement the next morning, the case was channeled through irreversible judicial proceedings. After years of judicial proceedings, Gregorian Bivolaru was acquitted of the charges of sexual intercourse with a minor in 2010, and this was confirmed 1 year later by another court decision, after the prosecutor's office had appealed the not guilty verdict. But the judicial saga was still not finished, and in May 2013, Gregorian Bivolaru was declared in a final judgment guilty of one single offense, repeated sexual intercourse with one minor from 2002 to 2004. All the other charges were false and were dropped for lack of evidence, but they had been largely publicized in the media, and that's what public opinion will always remember. In 2013, I was in Romania to collect some information about MISA and their spiritual leader, and to check the reality or not of the accusations of sexual intercourse with a minor brought in court against Gregorian Bivolaru. I met that girl, who was not a minor anymore, of course, when I had the opportunity to talk to her, and I interviewed her. And this is what she told me, that at 8 a.m. on the 18th of March 2004, while she was just waking up from her night rest, she was then 17 and a half, she was suddenly surrounded by some 15 armed and masked policemen while she was just barely dressed, someone started filming her from half a meter distance. Her narrative of these events was summarized later on as follows by the Supreme Court of Sweden in a court decision in 2005 in the case of extradition of Vivolaro, requested at that time by Romania. So she thought that the people around her were thieves. She was frightened and ran thinly dressed into her girlfriend's room where she tried to hide. In a minute, black-dressed men got into the room and aimed weapons at all of them. They were ordered to lay themselves down on the floor where she was left thinly dressed for half an hour. When she tried to get up, she was kicked in her chest. And after many hours, during which search of premises went on, she was brought to a place unknown to her, which, as was told her later, belonged to the prosecution authority. There she was humiliated and forced, as dictated by the interrogation officers, to write an accusation against Gregorian Bivolaru. On the day later, the minor accompanied her lawyer to the prosecution authority in order to retract the statement that she had been forced to sign, and I say it again, in the absence of her parents and the absence of a lawyer, but a revised statement denying any sexual abuse was not attached to the documents of the file. Now, about the context between the minor and Gregorian Bivolaru, this is what she also told me the exact facts. It is in 2002 that she started to get interested in the yoga teachings of Gregorian Bivolaru and participated in his yoga camps taking place in her region. 1 year later, she started sharing a life with her partner. And when I met them for an interview 10 years later, they were still in partnership relationship. Here's what she told me again, in the presence of her beloved, that she was never a yoga student of Gregorian Bivolaru. She first saw him from distance at the annual MISA yoga camp in Costinesti in 2002, which was attended by thousands of people. And later on, she met him during his public conferences and during social events attended by many. The girl confirmed me in the presence, again, the presence of her boyfriend for 10 years, that she never had any sexual intercourse with Bivolaru. Moreover, at the time of the alleged sexual abuse, Gregorian Bivolaru had a love relationship with a woman living in the same building as the minor girl. In the light of these love partnerships, the accusations about the alleged sexual intercourse during 2 years should have been considered very fragile, but they were not. Every time, the minor confirmed the real facts that I have just exposed in the presence of her partner, who believed her, including when I met them on the 10th anniversary of their life together. Over 9 years of the judicial procedures, the minor girl was summoned many times to court hearings. And she told me, to conclude my presentation, and I quote her, "My life has been completely destroyed by the Romanian judicial system and the media. Instead of trying to forget my traumatic experience with the police, I had to repeat the reality of the facts to judges who were doubting my sincerity," unquote. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fautré. Indeed, quite a heavy story, as the ground of all this case. We'll go now to further explanations and to understand the perspective of a lawyer, Mr. Alessandro Amicarelli. Attorney Alessandro Amicarelli is the current chairman and spokesman of the European Federation for Freedom of Belief, FOB. He is a frequent speaker at academic and legal events and conferences and meetings held in different countries and at different places. Dr. Amicarelli has extensively lectured in human rights, taught courses on the international protection of human rights, and he has a strong interest for minorities and religious freedom of both new religious movements and traditional minority religious and spiritual groups and of their members. Alessandro, please, the floor is yours.
Let me just say that Massimo Introvigne wrote this lovely book. You can find it online on all major platforms. And thank you to the previous speakers, also to Camelia and Konrad, that made a very interesting introduction of the case involving MISA yoga, Mr. Vivolaro, and unfortunately, what happened to MISA and to Mr. Vivolaro is something that has happened to several yoga masters and minority spirituality groups and minority religion groups in the East and in the West. And when these cases, some of which were, some of the aspects of the case were mentioned before, happen in democratic countries, that's even more scary, because we understand how problematic is the concept of democratic society and how easy it is to go back to a previous status, like in Romania, before democracy was achieved. And the old case of Mr. Vivolaro and MISA gives us the understanding that there is a connection to the past of Romania that is still ongoing. There has been no disconnection from that past. We know that Mr. Vivolaro was having issues and was being arrested before the collapse of the regime, and that things have not changed afterwards. Maybe things have even worsened. And from a democratic perspective, of course, the fact that he was being persecuted during the democratic transition and after Romania had reached fully democratic status. And as Konrad recalled, at some point, Romania was about to join the European Union, and there were still issues in Romania, and still nowadays there are issues. Also, there are issues in Romania in regards to the Vivolaro case, in regards to the accusations coming from the public prosecutor that at some point only last year added one accusation of fascist propaganda to the accusations against Mr. Vivolaro. In his book, Massimo, chapter 2, he recalls the case of another case involving Guru Yara. And he wonders whether Mr. Guru Yara is a cousin of, quote, of Mr. Vivolaro. In some way, because there is a similarity, not only in terms of beliefs and practices, but in terms of treatment received by the public authorities. We had a lovely session on tantric yoga in Turin at the CESNUR conference, where some of us raised the issue that there were issues of democratic standards in today's Czech Republic. But it's not me saying it, it's the facts that are reporting that this is happening, because the Czech Republic is constantly found in violation of the provisions of the European Convention of Human rights. So 15 years after the collapse of the regime, so after the Christmas Revolution of 1989, there was Operation Christ, which happened 18th of March 2004 in Romania. And this is the ride, the police ride Konrad hinted at, when in a kind of very aggressive police raid, special forces, masked and armed with machine guns and pistols, accompanied by journalists and TV cameramen, started this ride against MISA yoga. This is something that happened in other cases, and quite often these police raids are filmed to make the case bigger, even though, as in this case happened, no drugs were found, no other kind of illegal activities could be actually pointed out in the case. Nonetheless, Mr. Vivolaro was being accused, as Willy mentioned in his presentation, of sexual abuse. But the accusation have gone even beyond this, even making false claims that also from a legal point of view are totally wrong. When someone works for free for an organization, which can be a religious organization, a spiritual organization, or even a secular organization, for free, that's called volunteering for the organization. Here in London, there are thousands of charity shops where people work for free, give their time for free, give their work for free for a charity. That's completely legal and understandable that people want to give their time for a good cause. This was happening also inside MISA, but the public prosecutor accused Mr. Bivolaru of human trafficking, which from a legal point of view is completely wrong. That could be labeled as exploitation, human exploitation, but certainly not trafficking, because trafficking was not involved in the case. And of course, it was not a case of exploitation either. So from the case of MISA, we also, if we look at the old case, it's also like revising geography in primary school, because it involves cases in a number of countries. It is not only Romania, but France is involved, Finland is involved, Sweden is involved, and Rosita Sorite will be talking about the this matter in Sweden, and even the case reaches South America as well. But how is it possible that something like this can happen? This happens because there is behind the prosecutions, there are the anti-cult movements, and at times there are also psychologists that work in connection with the anti-cult groups, as this happened in the case of MISA yoga. Going to the legal cases in Romania, as Massimo reported in the book, basically the alleged sexual improprieties quickly collapsed, and he was found not guilty, but in first and second degree, but first degree and on appeal as well. There was an appeal to the Supreme Court, and there was the case that Willy spoke about. At some point, Mr. Bivolaru obtained asylum in Sweden, where he spent about 10 years of his life. Unfortunately, in 2016, he had the very bad idea to travel to France. France, as we all know, is not the best country for minority religions, minority groups, as also in France, there have been very, very important issues with religious movements targeted as the cults, psychocults, and at some point they even made a list of groups that were not considered as fully compliant with the values of the French Republic. So he was arrested in France. That, as Massimo reminds, is not particularly friendly to cults. And this happened because Romania had its name added to the Europol list of most wanted people. He managed to go back to Sweden. Meanwhile, there was another case in Finland, and this is quite surprising because Finland is a very sexually liberated country, is a very liberal country. So nobody would expect that a tantric yoga movement could expect the kind of problems that MISA went through in Finland, where Mr. Bivolaru was accused of, as usual in these cases, of brainwashing, manipulation, and alteration of the will of women that were listening to his recorded lectures. It's very important that, I mean, I like to mention this fact that Finland is a sexually liberated country because it's a liberal country. It's a northern country, and nobody would expect something like this from Finland. Consider that Sweden is treating Mr. Bivolaru in a wholly different way. But of course, also what happened in Finland was influenced by the action of I will say unethical journalists, TV programs that were very biased against this kind of groups, and for this reason, this was the kind of treatment that was received in Finland. What is interesting, though, in the MISA yoga case are the cases taken to the European Court of Human Rights. Taken to the European Court of Human Rights by victims of the raid. So the European Court of Human Rights, in the case Fautré versus Romania, decided that the human rights had been violated. The rights of the European Convention of Human Rights had been violated. And this was a prelude to the landmark human rights, European Court of Human Rights decision, Amicarelli and others versus Romania of 2006, where 26 members of MISA Yoga were given damages by the European Court of Human Rights. There are more cases also involving that Romania had to pay 7,000 euros to Mr. Vivolaro for being illegally detained in Romania. There was one more case which was not successful, which related to the illegal deportation of Mr. Vivolaro to Romania from France while being a political refugee in someone been given asylum in Sweden. This case was not successful in the European Court of Human Rights, but still the majority of the cases were in favor of MISA. Geography: from Europe, we go to South America because of the pressure made by some anti-cult organizations and by a psychologist as well, was claiming that MISA yoga was practicing porno yoga, manipulation, and so on. MISA yoga had issues also in in South America, especially in Uruguay, where the teachings of Mr. Bivolaru had reached some communities, and some people were interested in his teachings and practices. So the case reached the court, but the interesting thing is that the judge dealing with the case, which was a lady, and that's interesting to point out this this thing in my view, that she was a woman. She rejected the prosecutor's request to prosecute Mr. Bivolaru and those from MISA Yoga, giving also an interesting explanation as to why the case should be stopped. The reason is that the judge said the fact that MISA may have had issues in Europe, and there are no issues here in Uruguay with them, does not mean that there will be issues with them also in this country. So the case was basically stopped and discontinued. Of course, this doesn't mean that the case will end in Uruguay or in other areas of South America or anywhere else. So we must be very vigilant and helpful. Try and do our best to help. There is a theory coming from MISA that there may be the Freemasonry behind the persecution of MISA and Mr. Bivolaru. This is also reported in the book. Personally, I don't think this is the case, and certainly it's not from the official Freemasonry, which is based in England and has affiliations in other countries. But Freemasonry, like many churches, is something free. Anyone can start their own mission or their own Freemasons organization. So there may have been someone calling themselves Freemasons behind the investigations against MISA and against Mr. Bivolaru. There is also an interesting theory about dates. 18th of March was the date of the raid. 18th March was the date of some other important events in the case and in other cases in the past. Also an interesting case from the Middle Age, but of course these are just this may just be coincidences and not the fact that there is a connection and a specific reason why the raid started on the 18th of March or any other reason. But we must be vigilant, and we wish all the best to MISA, to Mr. Bivolaru, and we do hope that we don't need to see more cases like this, especially in Europe, in democratic countries. Well, we cannot accept there is this kind of sexual fear of sexual practices in Europe. Is something that is not very common sense. You know, it's not understandable that in a democratic Europe there is persecution of groups that practice with consent of adults in the age of consent, practice sexual activities. This should be allowed. If there is consent, there is no reason why to prosecute and persecute them. Thank you, and for further information, buy the book, which is amazing.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Very interesting and large perspective upon the case. Thank you for offering to us. And now we move to our next distinguished guest, Mrs. Rosita Sorite. She is also representative of FOB, European Federation for Freedom of Belief, and she's the co-founder and president of ORLIR, the International Observatory of Religious Liberty of Refugee. For more than 25 years, she was a Lithuanian diplomat and worked a lot on security, human rights, and humanitarian issues. Since 2017, she has moved to the non-governmental side and started advocacy and promotion of human rights. In 2018, ORLIR has been created to defend refugees from religious persecutions. Mrs. Sorite, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you. I hope that you hear me well. So yes. I'll speak from the perspective of ORLIR as the mission, the main mission of the ORLIR is to protect the members from the religious persecution. And the case of Gregorian Bivolaru is a very interesting and very special case that I was using a lot in my work, working with other groups. So the fact is that on December 31st, 2005, the Gregorian Bivolaru was granted asylum in Sweden. And in this paper, I will reconstruct the events of 2005, which are an important precedent for asylum cases involving leaders and members of the controversial new religious movements. Indeed, I have quoted several times this case in my work connected to the Chinese refugees of the Church of Almighty God. The new religious movement in China, which is one of the most persecuted, along together with Falun Gong. And in the case of people who belong to persecuted religious groups in China, the Chinese embassy is very active by trying to exert their strength in various forms to pressure the national authorities of democratic countries. They're trying to convince that their asylum seekers are not, the asylum should be rejected for the reasons like not political, but is most of the time is trying to say that they committed crimes. We can understand their political aim is because every time asylum is granted to Chinese citizens, based on the fact that they are persecuted because of their religion, foreign courts of law confirm that religious persecution is a fact in China, which is not acceptable to the Chinese government, of course. Of the Church of Almighty God, the Chinese embassies continuously try to convince that they are arrested in China and sentenced not because of their faith, but because they commit the crimes and sometimes even the homicides. So these arguments, these Chinese arguments, are partially true and partially false. They are partially true because once a religious movement is included in the list of those prohibited by the government, so then it becomes like you are not exactly following the law. So, and for example, China has enacted regulations explaining how Article 300 of Chinese Criminal Code should interpret it. For example, attending prayer meeting of a banned movement, trying to convert friends or relatives, and even keeping at home a certain quantity of religious books or videos published by the group are all activities defined as crimes under Chinese law. Thus, if one follows the logic of the Chinese system, for the mere fact of being active in their religion, these asylum seekers have committed crimes. The arguments used by the Chinese embassies are also partially false, because in the case of the Church of Almighty God, they claim that members of the group also commit common crimes, including homicides. It is in supporting the Chinese refugees against the charges that they encountered the Vivolaro case of 2005. it nicely establishes the principle that when you are a leader or a member of a persecuted religious movement, accusations of common crimes against you should be not easily believed, and you cannot expect a fair trial. As some of the teachings of MISA about sacred eroticism and teachings putting together eroticism and religion often cause great scandal and opposition, and MISA in this case is no exception. Anti-cultists and the Romanian Orthodox Church launched in early 2000s a virulent campaign against Vivolaro and MISA, claiming that underage girls were sexually abused within the group and also exploited and put to work for the movement without salary, which supported an accusation of human trafficking. We already heard that on March 18 of 2004, heavily armed police officers and military of the Special Forces of Romania, accompanied by media, entered at the same time at 7 a.m. 16 MISA ashrams throughout Romania and private homes of MISA students. The media were told and repeated that it was the largest anti-drug operation in the history of Romania, as the authorities expected to find in MISA ashrams large quantity of drugs, as well as evidence of sexual abuse of minors. And in that case, several devotees were detained, and subsequently, Vivolaro was also arrested. So at the end, not a single illegal drug was found during the raids, and the accusations of sexual abuse of minors also quickly collapsed. Several years later, in the case of Amicarelli and others versus Romania in 2016, the European Court of Human Rights castigated Romania for the raid, stating that it was based on insufficient evidence and conducted with disproportionate violence, and Romania had to pay damages to the victims. In the end, the Romanian prosecutors had to admit that they cannot accuse Vivolaro of improper sexual relationship with minors either, except they said, in one case, they claimed that we already heard about this case through several speakers, that at that time, 17-year-old girl, we call MD, had admitted to a sexual relation with Vivolaro. In Romania, the legal age of consent was 15, but the law punished sexual relations between teachers and their students, and Vivolaro was regarded as the yoga teacher of MD. MD claimed that the police had terrorized her and compelled her to sign a position accusing Vivolaro that in fact she had never rendered, and the MISA leader was found not guilty in first and second degree. However, in 2013, these verdicts were reversed by the Supreme Court of Romania, and Vivolaro was sentenced to the unusually heavy jail penalty of 6 years. Equally unusual was that because of this comparatively minor crime, Vivolaro was placed on the Europol's list of most wanted fugitives, as by that time he was no longer in Romania. So now about the Sweden case. In 2005, Vivolaro was liberated from jail, awaiting trial, and moved to Sweden, where he was arrested following a request by the Romanian authorities. So on March 24, 2005, he requested asylum in Sweden on the basis of religious persecution in Romania. In April, Romania answered the two subsequent requests of extradition. The second request was formed in secrecy, and doubts were raised about its legality. The chief public prosecutor of Sweden referred the matter directly to the Supreme Court, which conducted a trial in October of 2005. Gregorian Bivolaru was first heard. He told the justices that he was the victim of religious and political persecution. He denied even having had a sexual relationship with MD. He also described the continuous harassment of MISA in Romania by certain media and politicians. Even his home had been set on fire. He also insisted that MISA devotees are free to support or not to support the ashrams by performing volunteer work there. This is similar to volunteer work performed in many other religious organizations, and has nothing to do with human trafficking. The first witness introduced by defense was Carl Erik Nylund, a Lutheran pastor and the author of several books critical of cults. Unlike mainline scholars of new religious movement who do not use the word cult, Nylund believes that cults exist. His definition of a manipulative cult is that one as characterized by 4 A's. Aggression, meaning punishment of the members criticizing the leader or the movement. Aversion, criticism and persecution of the people outside the group as parents, for instance. Alienation, closed circuit inside the sect as a geographical or ideological group, and when the sect becomes the new family. And the absolute truth. They only exist within the sect, and the leaders are entitled to the absolute right of interpreting the truth. In fact, Nylund believes that if at least 3 of the 4 A's are present, the group is a cult. Having interviewed several members of MISA and Vivolaro himself, Nylund concluded that none of the 4 A's is found in the movement, which therefore is not a cult. In the written report he gave to the Supreme Court, Nylund wrote that in MISA, quote, "I found nothing of the first 2 A's, aggression and aversion. With regard to the ashram life, only a part of the persons live there, and the activities are not of the closed circuit type. The courses are accessible to anyone from the outside. Anyone may attend the courses. Therefore, we are not talking about alienation. Some of those who are more dedicated may have a minimum contact with the outside world. However, leaders actively seek to oppose this form of alienation by encouraging them to return to their work and family." Gregorian Bivolaru does not claim to be in undeniable possession of the absolute truth. Together with other people, he is a spiritual guide and is convinced he is a man with a mission in the society. Therefore, in the MISA case, we can find none of the criteria defining manipulative sects. End of quote. Nylund even added that some features of a cult are rather found in the groups opposing MISA and persecuting it in Romania. As a Lutheran critic of cults himself, he expressed understanding for the criticism of MISA by the Romanian Orthodox Church. However, he said, it is an entirely different matter when this criticism escalated into collusion with politicians who have dubious agendas, persecution, and violence. Nylund then examined the charges of human trafficking and sexual abuse. He noted that in MISA ashrams, I quote, "All people take part of the household activities from the ashram, such as cleaning, house and garden maintenance, house shopping," end of quote. He compared the rules of a MISA ashram to those of a student dormitory in a college. The difference with the dormitory, however, is that what in secular term is called voluntary work for MISA students is karma yoga, a spiritual activity. Accusing Vivolaro of human trafficking through compelling students to work without salary, Nylund said, I quote, "Simply is a misunderstanding of what karma yoga means. This issue at stake here is that of voluntary work is a manner of self-perfection and attainment of the truth. Many of the people living in an ashram do not have the money to pay for the stay, and through karma yoga, they have the opportunity to attend the ashram activities. The MISA followers state that karma yoga is a form of meditation that elevates those practicing it out of doubts and alienation. And this can turn the world we live in into a better place," end of quote. As for the accusations of sexual abuse, Nylund observed that his review of the Romanian documents demonstrated that the authorities had not grasped the meaning and role of eroticism in MISA teachings. They had reduced their lengthy discussions of tantric yoga to pornography only. Nealon concluded that, I quote, following the interviews I conducted with several Romanians from the diaspora, I have strong doubts with regard to the fact that Gregorian Bivolaru could be allowed a fair trial in his own country. As I could see by myself, the charges against him are obviously untruthful, and this is why they are the very evidence of the persecutions he is subjected to. Also, I do not believe that Gregorian Bivolaru would stand any chance for survival in a Romanian prison. End of quote. The next witnesses was Costel Birlandeo, a MISA student. He was an important witness because, as the court noted, he had been summoned by the prosecution in the Romanian case about human trafficking. In Sweden, he testified that, I quote, I was never forced to do any work, and Gregorian Bivolaru has nothing to do with the ashram's management, end of quote. He explained he had a regular job in Romania and had never considered giving it up to live permanently in the ashram. Birlandeanu also described the hostility he experienced from his own family members and gave a vivid account of police abuses during the 2004 raids. Another witness is the central person is this young lady called MD. And as reported in the Supreme Court's decision, she testified that, I quote, she lived in Bucharest in the same house, which was not an ashram, with a female friend who had a relationship with Gregorian Bivolaru. MD herself has never had any sexual relationship with him. Bivolaru has never been her teacher. She respects him because he has written many books and is a great person. She has participated in a trip abroad together with Bivolaru, but this was a group excursion for approximately 18 persons. She has never received any gifts from him. She has never been exposed to any compulsion within MISA, nor does she know of anybody else who was, end of quote. MD told the Swedish justices that her interrogation lasted for 4-5 hours, and what she signed under duress is not in any respect connected with the reality. The subsequent day, she consulted a lawyer who accompanied her to the prosecutor's office, where she tried to recount the statement she had been compelled to sign. She signed a new statement, as far as she knew, disappeared from the file or was never included. Asked whether she took yoga classes at MISA, MD replied that yes, she did, but her teacher was an instructor called CT rather than Bivolaru. She was also confronted with the fact that the police had seized in the apartment a notebook where she fantasized about the sexual activities with G. These were just fantasies, she explained, and at any rate, G was a boy at her age she was fond of, not Gregorian Bivolaru. The Romanian arguments for the extradition were then presented by the Supreme Court. The key point was that since Sweden had signed a treaty of extradition with Romania, it should trust the Romanian authorities to base their request of extradition on proved facts. It was also mentioned that Romania was at that time a candidate to membership in the European Union. And during the process of accession, it was acknowledged that the country had an independent and effective judicial system. Gregorian Bivolaru was then interrogated a second time. He confirmed that when he had visited the house where MD lived, it was to meet or pick up his girlfriend, who shared the apartment with MD rather than MD herself. He reiterated that charges against him had been fabricated in an attempt to, I quote, destroy me and this yoga school, end of quote. And then another quote, in my case, I'm extradited, he added, the Romanian authorities will be able to say that the Swedish authorities considered me guilty as well. and subsequently they will arrest the other defendants in the case who are also not guilty, end of quote. Bivolaru solicitor Nicholas Larsson concluded that the hearings had conclusively proved that the case against Bivolaru was a fabrication and that he had no chance of receiving a fair trial in Romania. He asked that Bivolaru be immediately released, although this was not technically possible until a verdict on the extradition would be rendered. The Swedish Supreme Court announced its decision on October 21, 2005. The decision first summarized Bivolaru's concerns about the risks he would run if extradited to Romania. He told the court that prominent Romanian politicians had warned him that, I quote, unless he dissolves MISA, he would be crushed mentally, physically, with all means, end of quote. On the other hand, the court noted that a valid treaty of extradition was in force between Romania and Sweden, and the decision issued in Romania should, as a consequence, be accepted in Sweden. I quote, unless it is, in specific cases, evident the decision is obviously incorrect, end of quote, or it can be feared that the defendants will not receive a fair trial in their country of origin or will be at risk of persecution and violence. Romania, the court reported, argued that the warrant of arrest against Bivolaru was not incorrect because it was based for the accusations of human trafficking on the interrogations of students who worked at the ashrams without a salary, and for the case of sexual abuse of MD on the girl's first statement. It is true the Romanian authorities admitted that MD later tried to withdraw her statement, but they assumed that this has been done upon the pressure from persons around Gregorian Bivolaru. Romania, the court added, has also mentioned a third reason why Bivolaru's arrest was ordered and should be extradited, because he may disturb the public order in Romania, accordingly to the Romanian arguments. On the first point, human trafficking, the court referred to the expert testimony of Pastor Nilun to state that the activities carried out by MISA students in the ashrams should be interpreted in the context of the movement beliefs. One of the students interrogated by the Romanian prosecutor was Barlandeneo, and his name was mentioned in the documents filed by Romania in support of the request for extradition. Yet the same person appeared as a witness in the Swedish case and confirmed that the work done by students in the ashram was volunteer and did not feel exploited. The Swedish Supreme Court concluded that it appears improbable that Gregorian Bivolaru has been guilty of trafficking in human beings. As for the case of MD, the justices stated that when she testified in Sweden, she has made a trustworthy impression. They concluded that the apprehension and questioning of MD took place in such forms and ways as to cause serious misgivings. The third point made by Romania, that Bivolaru's liberty was a threat to Romanian public order, was regarded by the Swedish Supreme Court as crucial, not for granting extradition, however, but to denying it. The Swedish court reported that according to Romania, the public order argument supporting the extradition of Bivolaru derived from the fact that the well-known public reaction when people had become informed that serious criminal acts had been committed against certain underage individuals had caused a certain social tension justifying a drastically preventing action, meaning arrest and detention, to be taken against Gregorian Bivolaru. The Romanian side had also mentioned a speech in the Romanian parliament in which Gregorian Bivolaru was referred to as Satan, psychopath, wretch, terrorist, villain, followed by a request to the public prosecutor to arrest him immediately. Another important reason for immediate arrest was emphasized by Romania that parents of children whose life Gregorian Bivolaru would have destroyed would have had justice done otherwise, for example, by lynching him. That was, I'm sorry, I didn't mention it was a quote. These circumstances, the Swedish justices observed, did not in any way support the request for extradition, but supplied excellent arguments to deny it. The Supreme Court noted that in doubts notwithstanding, it may have been difficult to prove conclusively that the Romanian arrest warrant was obviously incorrect on the two charges of human trafficking and abuse of MD. However, these points, according to the Swedish justices, were superseded by the fact that Romania's own argument about the public order situation around Vivolaro conclusively proved, I quote, that due to his religious conception, Gregorian Bivolaru runs the risk of being exposed to pursuits of evil character after an extradition. End of quote. The climate described by Romania itself virtually guaranteed that any trial of Bivolaru in that country would not be fair, and that the Romanian authorities stated that it may even be lynched. For this reason, extradition was refused and Bivolaru was liberated. The Supreme Court's decision opened the way to grant the asylum to Bivolaru in Sweden in 2005. As a refugee, Gregorian Bivolaru lived quietly in Sweden from 2005 on, although Romania kept him on the list of Europe's most wanted fugitives. And we already heard the mentioning that in 2016, he visited France, a country where anti-cult movements is specifically influential, and he was arrested and extradited to Romania against Swedish protests. Although the legal issue remains controversial, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in 2021 that it was in France's power to decide to extradite to Romania a Romanian citizen who had obtained asylum in another European country, in this case, Sweden. So Bivolaru thus went from France to a Romanian jail on July 22, 2016, where he started serving his term for the case of MD. So, and in 2017, he was freed on parole and allowed to legally return to Sweden. So, and that ends the analysis of the refugee case in Sweden. And the situation, the new situation that arises in Finland already was mentioned by our friend Alex Amicarelli. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good and enlarging to have all these explanations. And yeah, I was just speaking with my colleagues before this webinar that reading again all these materials about the case and yeah, remembering all the parts, again, I feel kind of starting to stand for the human rights in this case. So many abuses happening in time and so many problems which were just inserted in the lives of so many yogis and teachers of MISA. But we have now the pleasure to have with us a MISA representative. And we have Mr. Mihai Stoian, also named Advaitananda. He's a senior yoga and tantra teacher. He is former scientific researcher in the Romanian Academy of Science in the domain of formal languages and artificial intelligence. Advaitananda is the senior teacher of Nata Yoga Center in Denmark and coordinator of the Atman International teacher training programs in yoga and tantra. He is the co-author of the Esoteric Tantra Yoga course, which with more than 400 lessons, it's having several years of teachings. He is also the author of the extensive 3-year meditation course in Nata Yoga Center. As a speaker, he is running seminars, workshops, and retreats around the world on a wide variety of topics, ranging from relationship, love and intimacy to frontier science, quantum physics, and human rights. Mr. Stoian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camelia, and thank you all of you for being here. It's an honor to see so much professional interest of people who can really have a qualified opinion in such a case, a legal qualified opinion. And in my short intervention, being a person who was directly involved in all these events, I just want to bring just a shade of this case, a light that is usually not visible, that is usually not considered. And I strongly hope that all of you researching in this will also look from this angle with openness, because these are facts. This MISA / Gregorian Bivolaru case was and will continue to be under the attention of those who truly want to help justice to extend its beneficial influence in this very delicate, I dare to say, delicate area of the spiritual human rights, of the human rights extended to those who have a certain belief or a certain set of practices that define their life and their set of beliefs. For this reason, I consider it is significant to bring under the attention hidden parts that is not covered usually by authorities in any way. I will start back in November 1994, when I directly participated, because I coordinated a publishing house. At that time I was living in Romania. I was coordinating the publishing house. A book is published in this publishing house, which was signed by Mr. Gregorian Bivolaru. In this book, he's analyzing with very pertinent observations and arguments the actions of the newly democratic authorities in Romania, and analyzing it in parallel with some occult organizations such as Freemasonry, and seeing, of course, this is just analysis, seeing their influence in the public space, which was increasing in those years in Romania. This was coming together with some public statements that Mr. Bivolaru made in some lectures with very large audience. I have to mention that in his lectures at the time, they were often around 5,000 people in attendance. And he made these statements similar to the analysis that was published in the book, which I personally edited, so I know exactly what was that about. Now, what is very interesting is that few days later, after the last lecture of this size, where I personally heard people amazed, and even people from the political echelon amazed by these statements, and were starting to question certain things, a devastating explosion destroyed Mr. Bivolaru's apartment, severely damaging the entire building in which this apartment was placed. Mr. Bivolaru was not at home at the time. And what is very important here is that two independent investigations, one which was privately ordered by MISA organization, and the other one, the official investigation from the fire department, finds these two investigations that it was a criminal intent that generated the explosion by the means of cutting a gas pipe, which was cut in a certain way to provoke a fatal gas leak in the building, in Mr. Bivolaru's apartment. After the explosion, a letter was received in the office of MISA at the time, and in the letter is stated that this was a needed warning for Mr. Bivolaru, and he should stop immediately any involvement in MISA and to do any so-called revelations, of course, referring to this newly published book. Now we move forward to the resounding, I would say, juridical victory in 2006 when, as the previous speakers were mentioning, Mr. Bivolaru received political asylum in Sweden, where the Supreme Court in Sweden considered that his life would be endangered and he would not receive a fair trial if sent to Romania for this case with MD, this allegations of sexual misconduct against this minor. After Mr. Bivolaru was establishing himself in an address in the city of Karlskrona in Sweden, at that address, letters of threat started to arrive, all of them being officially delivered to the Swedish authorities. Not even to this day, we have received any answer to any investigation, even though some of these letters were threatening that the entire neighborhood would be blown away. And we had a precedent in Romania about that, and we warned the Swedish authorities, and yet, to this day, we never heard about anything. Now, another very interesting case happened 10 years later, and several threats later, and several judiciary abuses later, which competent scholars like you here were talking about. In November 2015, a well-known Swedish TV channel, in a show that is very popular in Sweden, announces that the top name on the EU most wanted list is Mr. Gregorian Bivolaru, the Romanian yogi. Now, the interesting fact is, at the time, Mr. Bivolaru is in asylum in Sweden, and a Swedish channel announced that. Now, contacting this TV channel, they claim the information comes directly from Europol. Contacting officially Europol in December 2015, through the channels of Soteria International, they got the surprising answer that such list does not exist yet. And there is a project indeed, which didn't come to life yet. 1 month later, however, in January 2016, so just 1 month after the list was not official, it became official. The Europol website, EU Most Wanted, is published. And the only name at the publication of this website was the name of Mr. Gregorian Bivolaru, which was top and only name on the list of Euro Most Wanted. The list was populated a few days later with other names. Almost simultaneously with that, 3 weeks later, a blackmail letter was received. This is the letter that was received on Mr. Bivolaru's address in Karlskrona, and inside there was a content which was basically plotting the course of what Mr. Bivolaru will experience if he doesn't stop and if he doesn't give up his work within this organization, and if he is not completely silencing. An interesting fact is that the letter is even promising a reward if he is stopping that. Please note that in this letter of threat, it is point by point predicted what will happen with him in the next few days after, because this letter, I know directly how Mr. Bivolaru answered. He refused completely and publicly to give in to this. And moreover, he, instead of keeping this secret, as it is indicated, he announced that he got this letter. And 4 or 5 days later, as we can see on the dates on these letters, he is arrested in France, where he was attending it was a book fair where he was going to search for old books in spirituality. He was actually He is a person who collects lots of books, and therefore, exactly as mentioned in this letter, he is arrested. He was attending there, having a passport which was issued by the United Nations, passport covering his asylum everywhere in the world except Romania, of course, based on Article 1 of the Geneva Convention, the strongest protection one can have. Now, of course, my question is, how did the authors of such a letter knew what will happen with Mr. Bivolaru with such a precision? Now, the French authorities arrested Mr. Bivolaru and wanted to send him to Romania immediately. A trial was open in which the French authorities checked 4 times with the Swedish authorities about the asylum, and 4 times the Swedish kingdom answered to France that they stand, the asylum stands, that the arguments are the same, because actually France would be sending Mr. Bivolaru back to Romania on the same charges for which the Swedish Supreme Court was granting him asylum. So it was not another crime or something. It was exactly the same. Moreover, as you heard, even the alleged victim spoke personally in front of the 5 Swedish judges from the Supreme Court, and they completely dismissed the case against Mr. Bivolaru, granted him asylum in Sweden after that court case. So therefore, they stood behind this decision 4 times in a row, and then, of course, the French authorities still didn't take that in consideration. However, while the French court was waiting for a decision, the interesting fact is that the lawyer, the French lawyer, Mr. Spinosi, received a letter of threat himself, predicting, again, the incredible for specialists in international law, outcome from the French court. If possible, you can see in the image that letter, which Mr. Spinosi received many days before the court expressed itself. And indeed, even though I was there at the time, and we consulted more than 30 experts in international law, and Mr. Spinosi himself, he was saying, there is no way on earth France can extradite Mr. Bivolaru, covered by Article 1, Geneva Convention. This is just a formality. Everybody should relax. This is no possible. And yet he received a letter where it is said that Mr. Bivolaru will be sent to Romania to be punished for defying what he was asked to do. So in this ways, of course, the incredible happened. The French court decided to break in this way the Geneva Convention. Without any doubt, is a breach of this Geneva Convention, sending Mr. Bivolaru to Romania to be imprisoned, despite the fact of this case being the same for which is granted political asylum. Again, the question is, how did the authors of such letter knew the outcome from the French court, even though the outcome was so unbelievable? So in this way, with these undeniable facts, I just wanted to draw the attention towards this hidden, I would call occult side of this international case, and to add a needed dimension to this case. Very often, even as scholars, we tend to look at facts with a more cool attitude. However, these are also facts. These are also facts. They were checked, they were witnessed by people, and as you can see, there are dates on postal things, there are facts, and unless there is someone with incredible visionary capacities, which is predicting the future, or there is someone who is involved at the level of pulling strings where they make possible that the strings which are pulled in this case are in this way, making possible to pose such significant threats. As a person involved, as I said, very close to this case, for me, this dimension of the case is also relevant because it shows that the forces involved in this case are not just some poor, misguided anti-cultists, which of course they exist and they have a real existence, but there are also some other forces involved beneath. And as, for instance, the studies of the archives from the secret police in Romania were revealing to the studies of Mr. Gabriel Andreescu, these forces, they continued to exist even after 1989, and they are spreading around to many other levels of the society. Anecdotally, and with this I will end this intervention, anecdotally, in one of the articles that it was written by a very famous Danish journalist in investigating the MISA case, which was spilling over also in Denmark. We have experienced the same kind of persecution and, well, with the specific of Danish state, which is far more transparent. So a famous Danish investigative journalist was revealing the fact that she witnessed when Emmanuel Barroso, at time the chief of the European Commission, met the Romanian Prime Minister, at time it was Victor Ponta. Victor Ponta had in his hand the MISA file, and then Emmanuel Barroso started the meeting by questioning what is going on there. Now, of course, my question is, since when a case of a yoga teacher is subject of talk at such level? If not, there are some strings attached that are leading way deeper than we usually analyze. With this, I just wanted to thank you again for taking attention and looking into this case. I also want to say that this organization is far more than just this case. It's a wonderful organization that is really standing for values, but we also have to look into such aspects of life if we want to have the truth entirely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stoian. It's good to have also the inside perspective, not just what we can read in mass media or read in the court trials and so on. And now we move to an expert, to Miss Susan Palmer. And just to have an idea, Miss Palmer is the co-author of Storming Zion, Government Raids on Religious Communities, and also another book, The New Heretics of France, describes the rise of the government-sponsored anti-sect movement in France and opposition and discrimination experienced by French citizens whose spiritual association was on the National Assembly's guard list in 173 named sects. Ms. Susan Palmer is affiliate professor of Concordia University, member of the Religious Studies faculty at McGill University. Susan Palmer is a researcher, sociologist, and writer in the area of new religious movements, popularly known as cults. Her research area has always been in the field of new religious movements. I started your presentation just by mentioning the books, because actually this MISA case looks like very much just on your line of study cases. Please, Ms. Palmer, the floor is yours.
Well, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this fascinating event. And I was invited by Massimo because of the book that I co-authored with Stuart Wright. Stuart Wright, of course, is the first author. Here's the book. Actually, it looks backwards. Anyway. And now I realize after listening to this previous speakers that it's a real shame we didn't know about the two raids of the Guru Jara movement and path and the MISA, because it would have been an excellent example in our book. So what I'm going to do now is look at these raids, though I realize they've been covered in some depth already by Konrad and by Willy. And I'm going to see how they fit into I'm going to see how they fit into our study of raids. But before I get into that, I'd just like to say that I really enjoyed Massimo's book, and mainly because I found it was one of the most highly elaborated philosophies of sexuality I've ever encountered in my study of new and alternative religions. For a long time, I've been interested in doing a comparative study of new religions that practice, quote, free love. Mainly these three religions I've studied: the Children of God, also known as the Family, the Rajneesh movement, also known as the Osho Commune, and the Raelian movement. And they all have a religious rationale for, quote, free love or promiscuous relationships. But these rationales are quite different. The Children of God have this kind of selfless Christian sort of Good Samaritan approach that they have to respond to other people's needs and give them Jesus' love. And there's almost this idea that they're channeling the love of Jesus through, sexual, love. And Gordon, of course, did a study of their main doctrine, the law of love, which is, gives them permission to break the rules in the Bible about sex and so on. And the Rajneesh, it's more of a sort of, if you like, selfish idea of giving up your attachments and advancing more quickly along, the path to enlightenment. And the Raelians, it's more like trying to be like the extraterrestrials, and the idea that through sexual pleasure, sensual pleasure, your brain cells are sort of stimulated and the neurons grow between them, so you become more intelligent and you'll be eligible for cloning and immortality. Anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked by that, but it really is a fascinating topic. And of course, from a sociological point of view, you could study the, quote, free love ethic as a way of strengthening bonds between members and, bonds between students and teacher, using the Rosabeth Moss Kanter's commitment mechanisms theory. But anyway, what I'm here today to do is to look at these raids and see how they fit into our larger study of government raids. Now, Massimo goes into the complex and dramatic legal history of two yoga new religions, the Guru Jara path and MISA. Both were targets of government raids, MISA in 2004 in Romania and Guru Jara path in 2010 in the Czech Republic. Massimo quotes from Stuart and my study of government raids, calling his yoga raids Baroque theater that served a, quote, political agenda. So what I will do is look at what prompted the raids, the magnitudes of the raids, and the raid tactics within the framework of our study and see how it fits our analysis. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about our study. Actually, we decided to do this because of a conversation during cocktail hour at the Society for the Study of Religion, the SSR, in which we were both talking about how the group, our favorite groups, were getting raided. And I was actually in a raid in France studying the 12 tribes when the police suddenly drew up in their camion and, you know, surrounded everybody and arrested all the men who were working in the field. And I was just eating my breakfast. And of course, Stuart lives in Texas, and he was hearing it every day on the news when there was the raid on Waco, first of all, the ATF, and then the FBI, you know, siege. So, we decided we should start studying raids, and we found, in fact, that they were getting more and more numerous after 1990, and also they're becoming more and more militarized. And we were focusing at that time on raids in the US, and we were looking at Ronald Reagan's war on drugs and how they changed the law at the time in the 80s so that the police could use, or the FBI could use, military equipment against US citizens, because they wanted to, you know, use them against these drug cartels. But I don't know if this would apply in other countries or in Romania. How, you know, is there a legal history about using military force against private citizens, against, you know, citizens? So we launched a 5-year study in which we collected 116 raids, and these range between 1944, which was the raid on the Short Creek, you know, fundamentalist Mormons, and that up to 2013. And we had 17 different countries. And we found that most of the raids were in France, and then the US followed behind, and then Australia. And unfortunately, we neglected Czechia and Romania. Now, we found four main patterns in our study, and these have already been mentioned by previous speakers. First of all, behind the raids, there's this phenomenon of the rise of a transnational anti-cult movement, what Eileen Barker would call cult watching groups, which had become international, global, and we're all talking to each other. And so that really is one of my questions about what happened within the MISA raid. Were they influenced by the French anti-cult movement? Were they influenced by, you know, American anti-cult literature on brainwashing? It'd be really interesting to trace those links. And of course, it's kind of hard to know because the anti-cult movement doesn't exactly let you know what's going on inside its ranks. And of course, Konrad and Camelia talk about the international quality of this conflict and this persecution of Gregorian Bivolaru. The second thing we noticed was the political nature of these raids. How, first of all, in some countries, anti-cult groups seem to rise quite high in the political ranks, or they would have the ear of politicians, and of course they would talk to journalists, of course. Now in France is a very dramatic example of that, because what used to be a private anti-cult group, or kind of a grassroots anti-cult group started by worried parents, which was UNADFI, then became a public service, so that they received money from the government to do all sorts of things. And they also they could launch lawsuits more easily, and they would go around training, you know, medical personnel, military personnel, and also businesses. So they would have workshops on the dangers and horror of cults to different, you know, organizations in France. The other thing is how they would be, the raids would be used by politicians as there's this really delicious expression, crime control theater. I first came across it when it was used by Ryan Cragen, who was talking about the fundamentalist Mormons, you know, the Yearning for Zion raid in 2008. But it's also, there have been articles about it by Niederman et al. And here's what they say about crime control theater. So, and of course, Massimo mentions that it was, he calls it Baroque theater. That was his comment on the MISA raid. It was Baroque theater. So here's what Jedermann says. Policies such as America's Missing, broadcast emergency response alerts, safe haven laws, Megan's Law, and Three Strikes Law have provided the public with a feeling of safety and security. However, research has provided evidence that disputes their effectiveness. These types of laws and policies have become known as, quote, crime control theater, CCT, because they appear to be effective, they serve the public's best interest and provide a crime control purpose, but they are largely ineffective and have unintended negative consequences. So I think we could definitely call the raid on MISA crime control theater, because it wasn't, they did not find drugs, they did not find sex, they did not find human trafficking when they went in. And, you know, you have to remember these guys are going in with, I had a thing here. Oh yeah, anyway, I'll talk about the military aspect later. Now, the human trafficking thing, I've noticed this recently in anti-cult literature and in, legal conflicts between the state and new religions. And I first noticed this in 2006 when Stuart Wright and I were doing a research trip in France and in Italy, and we decided to go to the beautiful city of Assisi, where there's a yoga group called Ananda, and they're in their pedigree, they have Yogananda, Paramahamsa Yogananda, who was the original founder of that movement. Anyway, as we were having supper, I talked to one of the yogis, and he was telling me that they'd had a massive raid on their ashram recently, and all their computers had been taken, all their papers had been seized, they'd been grilled, and they'd been accused of I think fraud and also human trafficking. And it was all because one man had come to study yoga for the weekend, and he had to wash dishes and sweep the kitchen floor and do a few other chores, because they have this idea of karma yoga. I thought that was really amazing, because when I was in my early 20s, I went to stay at the Shivananda Yoga Center for the summer, and I really had a great time in the beautiful summer. And all I had to do was karma yoga. I had to wash the paying guests' sheets and peel carrots and things like that. And I noticed all the other people who were staying there, the other young people like me who were sort of hippies, were like really lazy. I mean, they'd sneak off and have naps in the afternoon, and they're all flirting with each other. And it was kind of like, I felt like we were all ripping off, the Shivananda Yoga Society. But, and the idea that someone would go to a yoga ashram and be so, and then complain that that this was exploitation and forced labor, and that it was a case of human trafficking. I found that absolutely extraordinary. And this was I think it was in 2006, I heard the story. And then I read this year that the case had been resolved and that the charges had been dismissed. So it took this long for this headache to anyways, excuse me, I just got in a roll there because I find it so outrageous. Human trafficking. Okay, to continue. Yes, okay, so I had two things. We found a transnational anti-cult movement and the political nature, the political nature of these raids. And then the third thing is we found the presence of journalists and the media, TV cameras, at the scene of the raids, which actually is really shocking because the effect of this is to undermine the presumption of innocence. Because if you have, the very same day, people speaking on the media and, interviews with irate ex-members and politicians like, who was it? I think, yeah, Konrad mentioned some leading politician who talked about the largest operation against drugs and human trafficking in the history of post-revolutionary Romania. I mean, this guy no longer has the presumption of innocence there, right? And I've seen that certainly in other groups. And you would think, and also, doesn't it go against the ethics of a journalist? A journalist is supposed to just observe and not be a party to, to conflict and legal, battles. But we have, extraordinary cases like when I studied the 12 tribes in Germany in 2014, there was a big raid on 2 of the communities in Bavaria. And there was a journalist who had infiltrated the group pretending to be a lost soul whose wife had dumped him, who was searching for spiritual, knowledge and so on. And then he put in hidden cameras and he filmed them spanking their children in the beet cellar underneath their, where they had their morning, worship. And he exaggerated the sound and put, things like spider webs and so he made it look really scary. And this was released on television. And then he was actually at the raid. He was sitting on the very first Jeep that came in. He was actually sitting on the hood with a big camera just as they came tearing into the raid. Journalist, he was like the general of the raid. So I thought that was like a bit much and, pretty outrageous that, it's kind of amazing really that the, police and the military will let a journalist take over and direct them. I mean, I understand getting a bit of knowledge about, the inside of the compound, and so on, but this is pretty amazing. And you had the same thing happening at the Nawabian Nation. The Nawabian Nation was called the United Nawabian Nation. This is a Black separatist messianic movement I studied. I wrote a book called the Nawabian Nation. And they had there was an FBI raid in 2002. And in preparation from that raid, the local sheriff was camped out on a hill across from the quote compound and with a journalist who was writing negative articles about the group. And they were pals, and this seems like very unprofessional, but you see this kind of thing happening quite a bit, Okay, so I've done the media. The other thing we found was, the escalating militarization of raids on minority religions and a increasing tendency to launch paramilitary raids. Now, often these are, obviously, I think they're nearly always inappropriate. And I think the rationale for them when they're applying for the equipment is to say, oh, they have drugs. And of course, that's what they did with Waco. They said they had a meth lab or something, some kind of drug lab, which is a total lie. And so they got their tanks. And maybe that's what happened in the case of MISA, that's because I don't know if the group had any history of drug use or in their rituals or anything, But anyway, they didn't find drugs. And the other thing is some of these raids go into communities which are nearly all women and children, and they come in with their Kevlar helmets and their, you know, Uzi submachine guns and their, I don't know much about guns. Excuse me if I make a mistake. I shouldn't talk about guns. I'll make all kinds of errors. And you know, and military tanks and helicopters and all that sort of thing. And is this really appropriate? I mean, women and children dressed in 19th century farm clothes, you know, really. And this was certainly true when they raided the Nawabian compound. You had like a few elderly men, children, and nearly all women. And it was just as it was a clone of the Waco raid, you know, the ATF raid on Waco. It was very similar. So this is amazing because Waco happened in 1993. And this is almost 10 years later, 2002, the Nawabian Nation in Georgia. And you'd think that the FBI would have learned something, but apparently not. Yeah, so we noticed, okay, so those are the 4 things we noticed. Now, the other thing is we found that there was when we looked at how these raids happened, when we tried to look at the, you know, the larger picture, you step back and you say, how did this come to be? And some of you have given some good hints about this and some good information about, you know, Romania and the anti-cult movement and politics there and the Freemasons and so on. But we came up with this model which of a coalition of interest groups, which you can also call a network of oppositional groups, or Stewart likes to call them counter movement mobilization. So we came up with this model where you had a sort of cozy relationship between the core opponents, who would be ex-members plus anti-cult groups and anti-cultists, you know, lone wolf anti-cultists. And then you would have state agencies like police or the FBI, or you might have child protection, of course, or youth protection. And then you would have the media and journalists who like to specialize in new religious movement stories. And then you might have, of course, the odd lawyer, or in the case of Mandarum, you had an ecologist of all things who was a very strong force in the persecution of Mandarum. And then they in the middle of this, and then they would all be uniting and sharing information and distorting information and magnifying information between these 3 groups of the coalition. And they would put pressure on state agencies to do something. And so eventually, you know, a raid would happen on the religious community. And there would be intermediate groups that they could have consulted, but they didn't, like human rights groups who have a lot of information about new religions and about, you know, situations like this in the past and about the law and religious freedom and so on. And they could have consulted scholars like me and Gordon and Massimo who study these groups and you know, try to keep up on all the latest theories and data, but no, they ignore us. And so yeah, that kind of coalition is very important. And we also looked at the role of apostates. Now it's very interesting that, you know, the apostate is, you seem to always have an arch apostate, or a very strong character with a really interesting story, who is determined to bring down the cult that destroyed her life. Now, of course, you know, we heard from Willy, who interviewed the mysterious young lady MD, and it really does seem very clear that she was coerced into writing up a statement, a complaint, and signing it, and wasn't told what was going to be done with it. And the very next day she recanted, or she retracted her statement, but it was kind of too late. And I found a similar thing happened in the Nubian nation when there was a young woman named Abigail, or Habibi they called her, and she was one of the leader's plural wives. He had like, I think, at least 50 wives, and she was very young, and she was really good at finance. So she was running the whole operation. She was doing their taxes and everything, and only 18. And when there was a lot of pressure, some other ex-members went to complain about him, and she was told that she had to choose sides, and if she didn't join the ex-members, her children would be taken away. She'd end up in prison. This was the FBI we're talking about. So she was intimidated into saying that he'd forced her to do certain slightly shady things about taxes, and that he'd forced her to have sex with him. So she had 2 children actually already by that time with him. And then she publicly recanted her statement, saying that, you know, they talked about having children and sex, and that she'd completely agreed, and that she'd been pressured by the FBI. And the group was very, very happy, and they sort of broadcast a statement, you know, a video. And then the next thing you know, she recanted the recant, and apparently she was so seriously threatened by the FBI that she was terrified. She lived with her kids, and so she, you know, recanted her recant. So that's kind of very depressing. But the moral seems to be that the forces of, you know, the social forces, the political forces, are so powerful that a little new religious movement with a mystical leader, you know, they're overwhelmed. I mean, it's not even playing field. And even, you know, followers who are actually loyal and honest and decent, like obviously this young woman was, they, in the end, they cave in because the forces are just too, you know, too much. So that was kind of depressing. Okay, so by the way, I don't want to go over time because I realize we're all a bit over time. My time is already passed. I'm terrible at keeping track. I think I started, when did I start? 10 minutes, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I can finish this off. I do tend to drone on and on, you know, so I don't want to torture you. Okay, so, when we look at the Guru Jara path, there was a raid on October 19, 2010 that Alessandro has already talked about. And there was a military elite security force of the Czech police, that sounds really scary, at SROC, plus something called ZIN from Brno, whatever that is. But anyway, the point is, it was police and military together. And in both cases, in MISA and the Jara path, there were multiple and simultaneous raids on yoga centers and homes, and they happened at dawn. So we found that also there's the idea of the element of surprise. You have to go really, really early before they have time to hide the drugs, flush the drugs down the toilet, or you know, shred the incriminating documents or whatever. And there's often simultaneous raids. There was a really big one on OKC, this Buddhist group in Brussels and also in France, simultaneous raids. I seem to have forgot the date, sorry, but anyway, I just wrote
in 1998. It was
Thank you. Thank you.
In Ogyen Kunzangshölin case, yes.
Yeah. So basically what I'm saying is what we found in our study about the characteristics of these raids and how they start definitely fits the data of these 2 raids in Romania and Czechia. They fit perfectly actually into our model. And I was interested in so Rosita was talking about the later, persecution that Mr. Vivolaro had to put up with in Sweden and so on in France. And so I was looking at the French anti-cult group called UNADFI, and they have something called UNADFI Bulls, B-U-L-L-E-S, which are bulletins about, the horrors of cults. So I looked up to see what they said about Vivolaro, and they trot out all the typical cliches, like Francis has this really strange idea about sects or dérives sectaires, which means, sects, dangereuses, dangerous cults, or the harm that comes from cults. And they associate Gregorian Bivolaru with abus de faiblesse. Abus de faiblesse means abuse of weakness, or it can be translated as undue influence. And there's the idea of brainwashing somewhere in that category. And the point is, it's considered, it has a legal status as a misdemeanor. And in 2001, they passed a law called Abu Pikar law, which made it possible to prosecute leaders of new religious movements, and if they committed, quote, abus de faiblesse, which is a terribly vague thing. Like, it's really hard to prove. But the fact that they're called a sect, already they must be doing it. So it's a kind of circular thing. And so they associate him with abuse of weakness. And they associate him with a dérive sectaire and secte dangereuse, and also menace pour l'ordre public, a menace to the public order. So they trot out all these cliches, and and they just sort of repeat some of the allegations that have been made against him. So yeah, I also wonder if the French anti-cult movement, UNADFI, they used to be called, well, there's MILS, which was the government one, and then later it was Mivelud, and then there's UNADFI. But I sort of wonder if the French anti-cultists didn't get together with the Romanian anti-cultists and share their wisdom. I know they did that in China. I was working with a historian of Chinese history and religion named David Ownby. He's in Montreal, and he went to China on a research trip, and he ended up going to an anti-cult conference, and he said that the head of MILS was actually there, networking with the Chinese anti-cult movement, and telling them about brainwashing and abus de faiblesse. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so in the end, in our study, we found that raid tactics are now being used routinely against new religions, at least since the 1990s. And investigations preceding the raids are poorly conducted, and a less violent means of enforcement were discarded in favor of, quote, dynamic entries and pre-dawn surprise attacks. And use of force operations were deployed, even though religious communities in the vast majority of cases had no history of violence or criminality. Despite the physical threat to the police, to police agents, they stormed the residence with automatic weapons in full military gear, battle dress uniforms, flak jackets, combat boots, Kevlar helmets, stun grenades, accompanied by helicopter, combat engineering vehicles, and snipers. In many cases, the residence housed young children and infants. This aggressive overreach by the state is deeply disturbing. So to sum up, we have, in our book, we have kind of two conclusions about why. We looked at how, and now we kind of look at why. Why is this happening? Well, one idea is that cults are seen as a threat to society because they're a threat to the sanctity of the family. Of course, this is nothing new. I'm sure you've all heard this before. But St. Augustine, in his, when he writes about sin, venial sin and mortal sin and so on, he makes it clear that sexual sin is when you interfere with God's will, which is to help people procreate. And so there still is this kind of idea, certainly in the Catholic Church, well, in the Christian Church, that non-procreative sex is against God's will and sinful. So that seems to be there somewhere. And also that cults, they interfere with the family. They interfere with the family lineage. They interfere with reproduction. They interfere with relationships between members of the nuclear and the extended family, and they undermine the family. And in fact, they're forming alternative families that are seen as dangerous. And then our second argument is that it's a reaction against globalization and foreign influences, and that there was a trans-European movement which had a Derive sectaire model developed by French anti-cultists, and that this kind of filtered down to other countries. And perhaps just the idea that yoga groups are promoting Hindu practices and Hindu beliefs is a threat to the local culture. I don't know, that's one idea. So, but finally, this is obviously a very dangerous development, this kind of martial rhetoric and war mentality, and the way that the police are seeing themselves as soldiers when their job is supposed to be to protect the public. Okay, thank you, that's all. So I'm available for questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And just in very short, to try to answer to your question regarding all this connection between how actually Romania got so influenced by France. In 1999, the rapporteur to UNADFI, it was Andreiana Stase. And actually, Adriana Stase was the Prime Minister of Romania in 2004 when the police raid happened. And as we know very well, nothing can move without the hand of a Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister, actually, Adriana Stase, was on the same side with UNADFI and also on the same side of FECRIS, we can say. There are different studies. We can continue in private the talk about this. I was studying with interest to see how actually all this network of things got in the same direction in the moment of the raid, of the persecution of MISA school. And now we move further to our next guest, Mr. Gordon Melton, distinguished professor of American religious history at Baylor University. He also serves as the director of the Institute for the Study of American Religion, which he founded in 1968. The Institute is devoted to organizing, motivating, and producing research-based studies and educational material on North American religion. Dr. Melton is a pioneering scholar in the field of new religious studies and helped to create the subdiscipline. He sits on the international board of the Center for Studies in New Religious, CESNUR, based in Turin, Italy, which has the director, Mr. Massimo Introvigne. But now, first, we give the floor to Mr. Melton.
I want to do just a couple of things here. As a historian who's been dealing with the issues that Massimo raised in his book for some time, I wanted to give us just a couple of takeaway points that are raised by all of your many fine observations about MISA. Underlying the attacks upon MISA over the years, I think, is an understanding that MISA is being dismissed as a new, innovative, and less than serious religious community. Maybe not even a religious community at all, but a secular community that is couching its teachings in a religious facade so that it can practice antisocial activities under the guise of religion, and thus get away with these ideas because of our love for religious freedom. At its worst, it would be dismissed as a sex cult, at best as a group living under the shadow of its founder, wishing to spread sexual immorality through the land. As I approach MISA, I see it's somewhat different, almost completely different, but as a group that has adopted and propagates some very ancient religious ideas, actually drawing teachings from 3 older traditions, which it has amalgamated into one. These 3 traditions are South Asian tantric teachings, Chinese alchemical teachings, and Western esotericism. Chinese alchemy is characterized by a search for immortality, which takes an immediate kind of emphasis upon the extension of life, doing things that will prevent one losing one's own life energy, doing things that would allow it to grow and accumulate life energy, and this would be a major step toward immortality. Chinese alchemy, of course, has become known for its search for the elixir of life and a search for magic pills to immortality, and the many attempts that it made to extend the life of emperors by giving them a magic pill. More often than not, those magic pills kill the emperor because they contain mercury, but that was part of the teachings. Less understood were the teachings about sexuality, in which a variety of sexual practices were offered to followers that attempted to preserve one's own energy. This included practices in which males had sexual relations with females but did not ejaculate. Chinese alchemy was actually introduced into the West, or at least had its first community that followed it in the early mid-19th century in upstate New York, a place called Oneida, in which the Oneida community practiced a form of community marriage. All the men were married to all the women, and they had a system by which sexual relations were formed. Now, obviously, the problem they had, if everybody was going to be having relations with everybody else, would be what do you do with the children, the pregnancies that arise? How do you guarantee legitimacy, so to speak? Their answer to this was a form of Chinese alchemy they call male countenance. this community lasted with its system for over 3 decades. They had less than half a dozen mishaps during this time. They had children that were born to the community over this, but they were planned births, and which they deviated from the order and actually wanted the children. They had only 3 or 4 children who were born through mishaps in their practice. So it's a very effective system. It became very popular. It was passed through the literature, and it has fed into the teachings that MISA have adopted. Possibly more important is the tantric system from South Asia, the Saivite Tantra, which took on a form in Buddhism, primarily in Tibet, and was concerned much more with enlightenment than with immortality. The goal of the tantrics was to find enlightenment, very, very popular pursuit through what today is India. Most people practiced enlightenment, pursued enlightenment through a form of denial. They denied the things of the world that they considered as obstacles to enlightenment. The tantrics took a quite opposite position, said, let's move through those things that our colleagues are denying and find enlightenment through them rather than by denying them. And of course, sexuality was a significant part of that. So the tantrics learned to practice various forms of sexuality, which would assist them in the process of enlightenment. In the West, there were forms of esotericism that practiced sacred eroticism, especially, and those forms begin to multiply when esotericism was released from many of its confines after the Protestant Reformation and was given a new birth of enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century, and came to the fore particularly in the 19th century. This became very, very public through ritual magic practices at the end of the 19th century, especially in organizations like the Ordo Templi Orientis, which we know was having had its period of leadership under a man named Aleister Crowley. They had their own forms of sexuality, which were designed especially to mobilize power and allow that power to accomplish magical goals. So you have 3 separate forms of sacred eroticism, and all of these contribute to the teachings that are adopted in MSIA. So the first point I would like to make is that MISA is not a new group that's thought up a new way to think about sexuality and to practice forms of promiscuity that are simply designed to oppose the forms that are offered in society, that they are rather perpetuating old forms of spirituality that have a sexual element to them and that include the practice of sexuality in its various forms as they pursue their own religious life. Second observation I'd like to make is that the rebirth of sacred eroticism in the West in Europe, in America, North America, even to a certain extent in South America, have come at a time when individual freedom is being rediscovered, is expanding through segments of the population that were normally at the bottom of having freedoms, particularly females in this case. And the new sexual freedoms that were being demanded became integrated over the years in the demands for individual freedom by different elements of the community, particularly women. In the late 19th century, this had to do with issues of birth control. It had to do with the actual spread of knowledge about how the body functions during sex, how sex can be had to the enjoyment of all people. And particularly, it attempted to separate sex from procreation. That is, people could have sex for goals other than procreating children. Those ideas became extremely controversial through the late 19th, early 20th century. As a matter of fact, they still are, and have to do with the ongoing abortion debate here in the United States, and various ideas of sexual politics that are functioning around the country. This gives an importance to these notions. Societies have, at least in our lifetime and in the generations immediately preceding us, have favored policies that they consider support a strong and stable family, that limit deviations from monogamous marriage in very specific ways, generally in terms of prostitution, but do not promote forms of reorganizing family life, such as the Mormon polygamy systems or various kinds of free love. And both religious leaders and political leaders have combined efforts to attempt to deal with these issues that are constantly before us. These two notions, then, I would suggest, provide a philosophical base to the kind of actions that are being taken against MISA, have been taken, are continuing to occur, and help us to understand why there has been such a vehemence directed toward them by various governments, in spite of actions that built around witnesses who offer false testimony, and built around what seems to be a social crusade for an antiquated morality. So that I would affirm both MISA's credentials as a religious group and MISA's right to survive in the context of the ongoing cultural wars we have over sexual behavior and the life of the family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gordon, for your very good explanation and enlarging view on sexuality. And now we move to Mr. Massimo Introvigne, our next speaker. Professor Massimo Introvigne is an Italian sociologist of religions. He's the founder and managing director of the Center for Studies on New Religions, CESNUR, which is an international network of scholars who study new religious movements. He's also editor-in-chief of Bitter Winter magazine. Professor Introvigne is the author of some 70 books and more than 100 articles in the field of sociology of religions. In his work, Professor Introvigne has served the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and also he served as chairperson of the Observatory of Religious Liberty, instituted by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in order to monitor problems of religious liberty on a worldwide scale. I invite Professor Introvigne to share his expertise in MISA case.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of those who promoted in some way my book, Sacred Eroticism, a book on which I would only make 3 remarks. Many have already discussed the legal cases, so I will not. But the first point I want to explain about the book is the title, Sacred Eroticism, because I believe I've been guilty of talking of or using the expression sex magic or sexual magic for many, many years. And then I realized this expression is actually not politically correct. It's offensive to many practitioners who prefer other expression. And also sex magic is very much used by anti-cultists, so I find the expression derogatory. In the case of MISA, understanding the terminology is already understanding the core of the MISA experience, because for MISA, sexuality is actually not a good thing. It's something bad. And the core of MISA's worldview is precisely the distinction between sexuality and eroticism. Sexuality mobilizes very low energies, and it can be used from time to time for the purposes of procreation, but has no, I would say, redeeming spiritual or initiatory value, and on the contrary, exposes the spiritual integrity of those practicing sexuality to very serious risks. So totally different from sexuality for MISA is eroticism, because eroticism is a process through which the couple enters into a resonance with highly spiritual and even divine energies, which are very much uplifting and can be used for our spiritual progress. So as Gordon mentioned, the one, but by no means the only difference between sexuality and eroticism is ejaculation. In sexuality, there is ejaculation, even what is called female ejaculation by say some sexologists, and in eroticism there is no ejaculation. But there are also, of course, other differences because eroticism is much more than a physical union without ejaculation. Is a physical union in which meditation and yoga, exercise, and a conscious focus on the divine dimensions of love. Love is very important for eroticism, contrary to what some may believe in who study this kind of groups. All these things differentiate sexuality from eroticism. So a good part of my book is devoted to try to understand and explain this opposition between sexuality and eroticism that for a MISA student is the key of the tantric experience connected with the human body, which, by the way, is not the only thing MISA does. They have teachings in other fields too, including the visual arts, I try also to mention. So that's the first point. Now there is the second point, which has not been very much mentioned today, but it's also an important part of my book. According to MISA, today sexuality is promoted against eroticism, not merely by human weakness, but because there are dark forces promoting sexuality. Some of these dark forces are actually preternatural, the demons, but some of these dark forces are very much humans, including the Illuminati. There is a long discourse in MISA about the Illuminati and one of the versions of Freemasonry. And in this sense, MISA can be described as part of what some scholars of Western esotericism call conspirituality, which is a word putting together conspiration or conspiration theories and spirituality. And this is an important template to understand also another controversial and recent aspect of MISA, that's the opposition to COVID vaccines, which is a theme which also can only be understood. Of course, there are other approaches to the no-vax position, but in the case of MISA, we can only understand the no-vax attitude on the basis of this conspirituality, or of the idea that there are dark forces at work, and these dark forces are also at work to promote the darkness or vulgar sexuality and to hide the truth about eroticism. I will not skip my third comment. One of the accusations against MISA is that not so much in reality the movement itself, but some of its students many years ago, it's now an old story, entered the field of the adult movies and produced movies which also explain about eroticism, and they considered erotic movies, but they ended up in the usual adult platform. So the critics say they are part of pornography. There is a long discourse again in MISA explaining the difference between pornographic movies and erotic movies, and why theirs were erotic rather than pornographic. But on this, and I'm going to my conclusion, I have two comments. First, I discuss in the book why did they do it, and I dismissed the theory they did it to make money, because they were in a way amateur in a field of sharks. So the movies were immediately pirated, placed on the internet, and they didn't make any money or very little. Surely they spent more probably to produce the money than they made money. Another theory I dismiss, they did it for proselytization. I don't believe anybody converted to MISA after watching these movies, and thus for the public of the YouPorn or Pornhub of this world, I always wondered whether the medium user of these websites, who is confronted with thousands of movies, when they find movies when there is sexual interaction, but when it's interrupted and they start explaining about tantrism or esotericism, well, they probably fast forward, but at the end of the day, they may prefer other movies without the esoteric or preachy part. So my explanation why they ventured, for a time they don't do this any longer and for many years, why some MISA students went to read into this world of the adult movies. Well, they did it for an esoteric reason. So they believe that by bravely entering this world where the dark forces, including the Illuminati, are very much active through pornography, by entering into this world, they were, I use the Eastern expression, riding the tiger, or converting the poison into elixir. So they had a deep esoteric motivations to this. And finally, my last comment. I believe, and it's the only way I will touch today on the legal cases. I believe we are all victims of the anti-cultist because we all fell into a trap. It's not important that we fell into a trap, but many prosecutors and police officers fell into a trap. Let me give you the example of the raid in Italy. Nothing came of it. Nobody was committed to trial, but in Italy there was a derivative of the Romanian raids. Even MISA was raided in Italy. And what we read in the media is it's a big scandal. They will all end up in jail because the police found in MISA, so not technically ashrams, but in MISA places in Italy, the police found evidence that they did adult movies or pornographic movies. Well, that was exaggerated. And also, I explained for them they were erotic rather than pornographic. But let's assume for a moment, not concede, but assume. Let's assume for a moment it was totally true. What was the crime? Because we find ourselves defending MISA from an imaginary crime. I mention in my book that according to a professional database, there are today in the world more than 200,000 professional pornographic actors and actresses. Of course, if they are minor, those who use or abuse them commit a crime, but that was never the case in the movies of MISA. So if they are not nobody goes to rescue these 200,000 people. They don't perhaps want to be rescued in the first place, but nobody goes to rescue them. And according, again, to professional data, it's a business which accounts for more than 1/3 of the internet traffic throughout the world. Nobody stops this business. Gordon probably remembers a scandal of some 13 or 14 years ago when it came out that the largest Christian investment business was also investing in pornography because it was a very good way of making money. So they invested the money of the churches in pornographic companies because the return was very high. When after it was published by the BBC, I believe they stopped doing it. But so what I'm not, of course, making any apology or propaganda for pornography. I don't believe that's an ideal or a good situation. But I say it's very normal. It's everywhere. It's 1/3 of the internet. It's 200,000 professionals in this business. Now, those who are oldish have retired. If you add them, it's probably we go to the millions. So why exactly is MISA singled out, assuming that they did, and perhaps they didn't, but assuming that they did, why is MISA singled out for something everybody does? And that was one of the questions I wanted to answer in the book. And finally, I came out with an answer, which is parallel. I believe we started formulating it together with an answer Henrik Bogdan gives for Aleister Crowley, saying Aleister Crowley was prosecuted in several countries for sleeping with more than one woman at the same time, but everybody was doing it. Why was Aleister Crowley prosecuted and many others were? And Bogdan for Crowley and me for Vivolaro, I believe we came out with the same answer, because the world is extremely tolerant of peccadillos like those of Crowley, and the world is surely, at least the Western world, if you go to Afghanistan and the Taliban, it may be different. The world is also extremely tolerant of adult movies. But what the world cannot tolerate is the crossing of the boundaries and putting together eroticism and religion. There is, as Alessandro Amicarelli said, a limited tolerance for religion in our world, and there is a wide tolerance for eroticism. But there is zero tolerance for groups that transgress the boundaries and claim that eroticism is religion and religion is eroticism. Because this miscegenation is regarded as contamination. And this is something our society is not prepared to tolerate. It plays in the hands of the anti-cultists, because for the anti-cultists, that's the very evidence that cults are subversive. And they subvert one of the biggest taboos in our society. There is no taboo about eroticism. There is not even a taboo about pornographic movies. They are everywhere. But there is a taboo against putting together eroticism and religion, and to claim that finally for the initiate, they are one and the same. And that's totally forbidden. And those who do this, they do this at their own risk. And just ask Vivolaro or Guru Yara, and one is fugitive, one Guru Yara is detained in a camp in the Philippines pending solution of a difficult asylum case. But these people are persecuted not really because they had abused the girl. No, that's not the real point. They are persecuted because they crossed the red line. And in a taboo-free or allegedly taboo-free society like ours, this taboo, which is very vigorously defended both by states and of course organizations like the Romanian Orthodox Church in Romania, is the taboo you should not mix religion with eroticism. Vivolaro did, and that's the reason why he was and he is persecuted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. And yes, there are new points, new perspectives to understand and to include. And we hope to take the information and to continue working in our fields, each of us. And for now, we invite Mrs. Eileen Barker to have the conclusions of this webinar. Mrs. Eileen Barker, Emeritus Professor of Sociology with special reference to the study of religion at the London School of Economics. She has been researching minority religions and the responses to which they give rise since the early 1970s. She has over 300 publications translated into 27 languages. She was the first non-American to be elected president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. Mrs. Eileen Barker, she is also the founder of Inform, Information Network, focused on religious movements, which is an independent charity that was founded in 1988, based at the London School of Economics. And according to Inform's website, the primary aim of Inform is to help people by providing them with information that is as accurate, balanced, and up-to-date as possible about alternative religious, spiritual, and esoteric movements. And now we invite Mrs. Eileen Barker to have the conclusions for this event.
Thank you very much. Conclusions. I'm afraid there are 7,852 conclusions that one could draw. And every time I heard someone speak, I changed my notes. And people seemed to sort of say things or part things, or I wanted to ask questions. And it's been a very rich and exciting conference, I think, in looking from the problem from a number of different dimensions. I've got to confess, I haven't finished reading this. It's gripping. It's just that I only got it a couple of days ago and haven't had time, but I certainly intend to finish it. I think my main thought has been, okay, we've grown to expect that we don't expect religious freedom in North Korea or in China or even in Russia. But I'm still surprised that some of the things that we've been hearing about today can happen in Western democratic societies. And I want to know why. When 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, I started studying new religious movements, as we called them, my question was, how can they? How could they possibly believe and do these things, which I could never possibly believe or do? And after a few years, well, several years, I started to think, well, it isn't a big question. I mean, they're actually quite understandable. And so this burning desire to find out still stayed, because there's always more to find out, and there was so much variety. But my question turned to, how can the people attack them so much? Why do they get persecuted? What's going on? What's underneath it all? What are the processes that result in this? Now we know a lot, and in discussions like this, we talk about different players, and it's relatively easy to see that there are some bad people who just lie, or some evil forces or what have you. But they only work because of a whole number of other people who play their role. A lot of them have been mentioned by Massimo and Susan, how they come together somehow to allow society, to allow decent, ordinary people to be prepared to back, or at least allow, and sometimes to contribute to this persecution. Are they making genuine mistakes? Are they just getting misinformation? And are they therefore perhaps suppressing alternative perspectives? It's a bit like the questions we've been asking about conspiracy theory lately. Why do people accept the theories? It's a different question from the people who put them out, telling direct things that they know are wrong. It's how does it work the more sort of subterranean way. We know that people have different interests. The lawyers, well, they want to win their case, so they'll select certain kinds of information and use that in order to make their cases. And the law enforcers, well, they've got to enforce the law as it's presented. And I mean, if there's a list and it says if your religion, or not religion, but your group is on this list, as in China with the Xizhao, then you're criminals, so you've got to be arrested. That's quite easy. But it's far, far more complicated than that. The politicians, well, politicians have got to protect us and they've got to get votes. But do they feel they're protecting us? Do they feel that they've got to stop people going over the red line that Massimo talked about? Well, there are red lines and people do go over them, and we do need to be protected from some red lines. But again, it's far more complicated. How does it work? The media gives us our pictures of these movements. And it's partly our fault because we all like the sexy stories. We like hearing about violence and sort of bated breath and thinking how awful it is and how bad people are, and helps us make us feel rather good because we wouldn't do those bad things. And we're not particularly interested in the normal and the everyday and the boring. And, you know, that's just not what will sell papers or get viewers or watchers. The anti-cult movement. I've been studying the anti-cult movement quite closely in America. I can't do it in Europe on the whole because they hate me so much they won't let me near them. But for the past 20 years, I have been looking at the American anti-cult. And there are some people I call just bad, evil people, but the majority of them are not. They're sincere, honest people. They've got it wrong, I think. They think I've got it wrong. But you can sort of get a bit nearer understanding. And I think we've got to do more of this. We've got to do more trying to understand why people will believe and do things which we couldn't believe or do. We've got to expose them, obviously. And this seminar, or whatever it is, Zoom, has been a good example of exposing, and exposing very well and making the point very well. But I think what we still need to do, and is far more difficult in a sense, is try to understand how it can happen, how we can allow it to happen, how we can try and explain it. And we've already gone an hour and 15 minutes over time I was expecting, so I'm not going to go on anymore. But I would just like to stress that I think there is work that we should do that's trying to learn how we can dissuade people from doing what we think is wrong, just as they are trying to persuade people to do what is wrong. Wait a minute, I've got that a bit muddled. Anyway, I'm sure you understand what I mean. We ought to try to be able to understand why people think in a different way than we do, and understand it enough to be able to persuade them to think as we do, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these conclusions. And indeed, there are so many points to take more and several questions to address. I just open the talk if any of the speakers wishes to comment something or to share something before ending this webinar. So the floor is open for everybody.
Thank you.
From the speakers.
I want to say something. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. It was great. There are two questions for me. One is about the judicial system. I think it was relating to Romania, but it can apply to everyone. So I don't think there is a problem with the judicial system itself if these cases of abuses happen. It's a problem of ignorance and bad faith mainly. So a public prosecutor accusing Mr. Bivolaru of fascist propaganda, it has nothing to, it's nothing in relation to the actual case, you know. It's total nonsense, you know. So it's either ignorance or bad faith. And it's the same for all other cases involving minority groups that are blamed or accused of this or of that crime. And the other question is about the case in Uruguay, which started thanks to the work of the Red Iberoamericana against cults or something like that, you know, this network of groups. Well, the question was, how is it possible that this kind of group and their members are set as experts? That's the same story as everywhere, as in Italy, as in Romania. There is a majority group that makes pressure against minority groups. In Romania, it's the Orthodox Church. In Italy, is some members of the Catholic Church, and the same is in South America. So I don't even blame the Orthodox Church or the Catholic Church. I blame the governments and the national authorities that should be mature enough to be totally independent and able to be third party and be able to do their job as representing everyone, not one party only, but the people.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. If anybody else wishes to say something before ending.
I would like to address this before ending by thanking very much Massimo, Professor Massimo Introvigne, for this very constructive approach, because from my experience, being also a person who, a scientist who addressed these things from inside and practicing these teachings of Tantra and teaching them for more than 20 years, it's very useful, instead of trying to solve just the legal aspects, to patch the problem, to go in the core of the problem, as Professor Massimo did so brilliantly with this book, which is going actually to the core of the problem, revealing angles that are always staying hidden, and because of that, people misunderstand MISA. If I can make this play of words, MISA is a misunderstanding, and I want to thank him from the bottom of my heart, because this is exactly what the scientific world should do with all the problems. Go to the core of it instead of trying to patch the effects. Go to the core, and we can analyze. And as very simply, in few words, he could say, from the perspective of his in-depth study on the difference between the vision on sexuality and the vision of eroticism, all the possible conflicts are coming out, and even the occult groups that feel threatened by this, they should read this book, and they will realize that many times they're just fighting windmills. So thank you very much.
Yes, and also I want to add that we are very grateful, and thank you very much to Massimo, because actually this webinar was done around the book and synthesizing several situations that MISA school and the yoga teacher Gregorian Bivolaru confronted during time. Thank you to all of you, to all distinguished guests and participants. And let's hope for another meeting where we can continue with new perspectives, and also maybe we'll have time for questions and answers. Thank you very much to all of you.